Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
After an historic face-to-face meeting, the leaders of North and South Korea have declared their commitment to work towards the complete denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. Kim Jong-un and President Moon Jae-in shook hands on the border in the demilitarized zone at Panmunjom, where an armistice was signed in 1953, pausing the Korean War. In a joint statement at the end of their talks, the leaders said there would be no more war on the Korean peninsula. Laura Bicker sent this report from South Korea.
This one outstretched hand could offer the Korean peninsula a fresh start. The North Korean leader, often a figure of fear, smiled as he took the historic step south. And then he decided to direct the action. Together, the two leaders crossed back and forth over a border that has separated them for 65 years. Mr. Kim announced he felt a swirl of emotion. An upbeat honour guard seemed to capture the mood as they headed for talks. A new chapter of history is being written, he said. I came here as if standing at the starting line, firing the starting signal. It's an emotional moment in this class. Half of the children watching are from North Korea. Their faces we can't show. They've left their families behind, and a peace treaty might be the only chance they have of seeing them again.
When was the last time you saw your mum?
2011년.
I last saw her January 21st, 2011. I hope from this meeting we can live in a world where there is no war and no more nuclear weapons.
After lunch, Mr. Kim was running a bit late, which meant a good cardio workout for his security detail. And then, in a day of extraordinary moments, came this. They simply went for a stroll in the most heavily fortified border in the world, and then sat for a chat while the world tried to lip read in Korean. They didn't keep us waiting long for their declaration.
정작 마주서고 보니 북과 남은
Facing each other, I wholeheartedly feel once again that North and South are the same people and the same blood, and we cannot be separated.
가슴뭉클하게 절감하게 되었습니다.
오늘 김정은 위원장과 나는
Chairman Kim and I reaffirmed today that a Korean peninsula without nuclear weapons is the shared goal through complete denuclearization.
확인했습니다.
So a longed for peace treaty and denuclearization.
그날을 위하여.
On the face of it, strong words of ambition and hope. But amidst the lofty language, there is very little detail. There was more political theatre as the two said farewell. And more signs of a burgeoning bromance. This is indeed a very good start. But as they both go home, the way ahead is still not clear.
When it comes to today, it was heavy on symbolism, heavy on ceremony. But when it came to those words of denuclearization, nothing was explained. There was no details. There's no framework. And this agreement signed today is previous to is like previous agreements. Certainly the language is very similar, and those agreements the North has broken before. The South says this is all about building trust, little by little, stage by stage. But trust is a difficult thing to build with a neighbour who's broken its promises before.
Laura Bicker in Seoul, thank you. Well, as Laura was suggesting, it's not the first time that the prospect of peace between the North and South has been presented to the world. So how different is today's summit and what lies ahead in the months to come? Our diplomatic correspondent James Landale has this assessment.
These are genuinely historic scenes from the Inter-Korean summit, a symbol of real détente between two long-standing foes. But is there actually a prospect for peace here, or is this just some kind of ploy by the North Korean leader? Let's not forget, these divisions go back many years. The Korean peninsula was carved in two by the United States and the Soviet Union at the end of the Second World War. Then, in 1950, the communist North invaded the South with the help of its Soviet allies. American and other Western forces fought back. The war lasted 3 years, claiming more than 2 million lives, ending in armistice, but not peace. And if today's scenes look familiar, here's why. There was another historic summit in 2000 when the leaders of North and South met for the first time to try to normalise relations between both countries. 7 years later, there was another summit when both sides agreed the North would freeze its nuclear programme in exchange for economic aid. But neither produced peace, let alone disarmament. Since taking power in 2011, Kim Jong-un has worked hard to develop his country's nuclear weapons capability, repeatedly testing ballistic missiles that he now claims can deliver warheads accurately to the United States. So is he sincere about denuclearization, and what does he mean by it? Well, the international response has been one of cautious welcome. Donald Trump said good things are happening, but only time will tell if one day both sides could live in harmony and peace.
When I began, people were saying that was an impossibility. They said there were two alternatives. Let them have what they have or go to war. And now we have a much better alternative than anybody thought even possible.
Some believe that it's Donald Trump's hard line that has encouraged President Kim to the negotiating table. Others believe Kim is just looking to escape Western sanctions by promising limited arms control. The question is whether the complete removal of nuclear weapons from the Korean peninsula is possible when the leader in the North sees them as so crucial to his status, security and survival. So today's summit does mark a real de-escalation of tension, but it is just the start of a long process. And there are no guarantees that at some point one side won't walk away.
James Landale. Well, let's also speak to our North America editor, John Sopel, in Washington. Is Donald Trump claiming much of the credit for this, John?
Well, I think that Donald Trump could justifiably say, I have done this, and no other president could have probably brought this about. Look, he inherited a policy of strategic containment. That was going nowhere. Then North Korea was suddenly doing these tests, which showed they were much more technologically advanced. And Donald Trump, unlike any other president I think would have done, he ramped the language up to volume 10. Weapons being locked and loaded, there would be fire and fury. He even talked at the UN about the total destruction of North Korea. I think that had two effects. I think it made North Korea realise that they were dealing with a rather different US leader, and I think it made the Chinese worry as well about what could happen to the peninsula. And the Chinese have played a key role in this, and Donald Trump has acknowledged that. Now, of course, all these talks could go wrong. They may not happen. But at the moment, it looks almost certain that talks will happen with Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. And, you know, 6 months ago, we were talking about the possibility of a nuclear confrontation. Now we're talking about the possibility of peace. And in anyone's language, that must be seen as progress.
John, thank you. John Sopel.
On both sides of the heavily militarized border and pledging peace. Despite technically still being at war, Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in were all smiles as they met and spoke of ridding the peninsula of nuclear weapons. The summit was welcomed by world leaders, including President Trump, but there was caution too. And there's still a long path to peace. From South Korea, our China correspondent Debbie Edward on an historic meeting.
It was with a purposeful stride and a smile that Kim Jong-un became the first North Korean leader to enter the South. He greeted President Moon Jae-in with an enthusiastic and lengthy handshake. He thanked Moon for coming to meet him and said he was excited to be there. But this historic moment on the Korean border was soon eclipsed by an impromptu invitation. Kim Jong-un persuading the South Korean president to take a spontaneous step into the north. Hand in hand, the two men then crossed back over the military demarcation line and entered Truce Village. It was there in Peace House that, following an opening joke from Kim Jong-un about noodles, they eventually emerged from their negotiations and embraced, having signed an agreement pledging an end to war on the Korean Peninsula and complete denuclearization.
Today we will make sure that the agreement we have reached, which the people of the Korean Peninsula and the world are watching, does not repeat the unfortunate history of unfulfilled promises by closely communicating and cooperating with each other in order to yield good results.
We also agreed to end the unstable armistice and establish permanent and solid peace on the Korean Peninsula through the declaration of the end of war and peace treaty.
It was a day full of symbolism and significance, but also at times the surreal. This was Kim Jong-un returning from lunch in his stretched Mercedes. Thankfully for his 12 bodyguards, it was just a short journey back from the north. There was then a captivating hour during which the two leaders took a pensive walk in the grounds of the demilitarized zone. The cameras were ushered away, but we watched as they sat deep in discussion, privy to the picture but not the sound. All we heard for 40 minutes was birdsong and the click of cameras. After one day, one dinner and one historic declaration, Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in have described themselves as good friends. In Korea, the threat of war has been replaced with a toast to peace.
This was an historic day for the leaders and the people of North and South Korea, and an emotional one for many people too here after a year in which conflict came so close. But this was a declaration which was big on promise and in many respects lacked substance. So the focus now shifts to President Trump and the summit he will have with Kim Jong-un in the coming weeks, where he must deliver a deal on the detail of denuclearization that would guarantee peace on the Korean Peninsula.
Debbie, thank you.
A moment in history captured in a handshake as the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un grasped hands with South Korea's Moon Jae-in and walked together across the border in scenes unimaginable just a few months ago. The two agreed to work towards ridding the entire peninsula of nuclear weapons, along with a peace treaty to bring a formal end to the Korean War. So is it peace in our time? Here's our international editor, Lindsay Hilson.
It was the first time since the Korean War came to a halt in 1953 that a North Korean leader has stepped into the South. It was all live on TV, broadcast around the world, and Kim Jong-un took advantage of the moment, persuading his South Korean counterpart Moon Jae-in to join him, stepping back into the north. That may have been spontaneous, but the rest was carefully choreographed, picture perfect. The honor guard was dressed not in South Korean military uniform, but in traditional robes, symbol of a shared culture and a unified past. And so to more handshakes and smiles, even a laugh and a bow. We rarely hear Mr. Kim speak, but we did today, again broadcast live.
오늘 이 자리에서 평화 번영, 분화 관계가 정말 새로운 역사가 씌워지는 그런 순간에 이런 출발점에 서서 그 출발선에서 신호탄을 쏜다는 신호탄을 쏜다는 그런 마음가짐을 가지고.
He had, he said, brought President Moon a gift, North Korean cold noodles. Surrounded by jogging bodyguards, Mr. Kim drove back across the border for lunch, presumably cold noodles, but then returned for a symbolic tree planting ceremony. Mr. Moon, elected last year, has long favoured rapprochement, But it's been hard to read Mr. Kim, who has ruled North Korea for 6 years. Last year, Little Rocket Man, as President Trump derisively called him, tested a missile that could potentially reach the US mainland. That, combined with his nuclear program, caused the UN Security Council to impose draconian sanctions. Today, the two leaders walked and talked on a bridge in the demilitarized zone. They were alone for half an hour, presumably discussing how to end the official state of war that endures between their two countries. They signed the Panmunjom Agreement, which talks vaguely about the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Cue a warm, triumphant moment, even though it might mean the South giving up the protection of the US nuclear umbrella. On Saturday, Mr. Kim announced a preemptive freeze of his nuclear program.
북측이 먼저 취한 핵 동결 조치들은 대단히 중대한 의미를 가지고 있습니다. 한반도의 완전한 비핵화를 위한 소중한 출발이 될 것입니다. 앞으로 완전한 비핵화를 위해 남과 북이 더욱 긴밀히 협력해 나갈 것을 분명히 밝힙니다.
우리가 오늘 북과 남이 전체 인민들과 세계가 지켜보는 가운데 수표한 이 합의가 역대 북남 합의서들처럼 시작만 뗀 불미스러운 역사가 되풀이되지 않도록 우리 두 사람이 무릎을 마주하고 긴밀히 소통하고 협력함으로써 반드시 좋은 결실이 맺어지도록 노력해 나갈 것입니다.
This evening, the leaders and their wives watched a sound and light display. Maybe it was President Trump's belligerence that convinced Mr. Kim to talk. Or maybe, now he has a nuclear weapon, he feels he can negotiate from a position of strength. And so his delegation returned north to prepare for the big summit in 4 to 6 weeks' time, with the man Kim Jong-un sees as his real enemy, US President Donald J. Trump.
Well, Donald Trump may be hoping that peace in Korea becomes his greatest legacy, telling the German Chancellor Angela Merkel that talks on the issue had never gone this far. And he claimed that he and Ms. Merkel had always had a great relationship. That meeting at the White House is going on now. Let's go live to our Washington correspondent, Kylie Morris. Kylie.
Yes, Christian, certainly the Chancellor doesn't enjoy the same kind of warm relationship as President Macron does with President Trump. I think we're able to see the pictures of a press conference that's just beginning here inside the White House. But what's critical is that there's already been tough talk. We know, certainly on trade and tariffs. The president seems to be determined to press on with these steel and aluminium tariffs and have them in place against the EU potentially next week. As well as that, there's, of course, this disagreement about the Iran deal. President Macron says that he thinks that President Trump will decide to pull out of the deal. Certainly, Angela Merkel would prefer that not to happen. The question is that with this extraordinary moment of rapprochement in the Koreas, does that mean that the president might be inclined not to tear up the deal? It's quite difficult to go into negotiations with President Kim at a time when he is trying to back out of a nuclear deal that he's already done in good faith with another country. But we know that President Trump is no fan of orthodoxy. He believes that it is his uncompromising stance that has brought the Koreas to this point, brought President Kim to the table. If we want some sense of what his kind of rhetoric used to be toward President Kim before this week, perhaps we should take a look at this.
They will be met with fire, fury, and frankly power, the likes of which this world has never seen before.
The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
So Rocket Man no more today. President Trump has paid credit to both the Korean leaders as well as President Xi for his part in bringing things to this point. At the same time, though, the president is insisting that the US will be no pushover in these talks. He says that previously the North Korean administration had played America like a fiddle, and he wasn't going to allow that to happen. He says that if these talks that he goes into with President Kim don't continue in the manner he wants to, then he is ready ready to walk away from the table. He made some further comments earlier today when he welcomed the US Winter Olympic and Paralympic team and said that he looked forward to a moment when all of the people of Korea can live in prosperity and peace.
They said there were two alternatives. Let them have what they have or go to war. And now we have a much better alternative than anybody thought even possible. I'll be meeting with Kim Jong-un in the coming weeks as we seek to denuclearize the North Korean area and the entire Korean peninsula.
Senator Lindsey Graham has said that he thinks that President Trump should now be nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. That's certainly the narrative here, that this is President Trump no longer just a deal maker, but a peacemaker as well. More seasoned observers, though, know that this is just the beginning of what could be a very long process.
Kylie Morris. Well, earlier I spoke to Governor Bill Richardson, who was the former US ambassador to the UN and has travelled to North Korea numerous times, and to Jean Lee, director of the Korea Foundation Center in Washington, D.C. I started by asking Governor Richardson what he thought of the extraordinary images coming out of the peninsula today.
Well, as somebody that's spent a lot of time on this Korean issue and the tensions there, I think it's a very positive, remarkable moment, especially for the Korean people. Tensions have eased a bit. I'm sure there's a lot of skepticism over Kim Jong-un's intentions. But I think symbolically what the two leaders did was really quite breathtaking, stepping into each other's territory. And it sets a very good tone for the Trump-North Korean meeting, the summit meeting. But still a lot of issues have to be settled. The issue of denuclearization, what exactly does the Korean War and the armistice agreement mean for both sides? But on the whole, a big, big plus.
Jean Lee, who feels to you as though they are in the driving seat? Is this Kim Jong-un who's really in control, or what?
I think they're both playing a role here very strategically. One thing that we should take note of is that, yes, Kim Jong-un is the one who offered that olive branch on New Year's Day to the South Koreans to really get the momentum started to lead us to this point now.
Are you instinctively skeptical, though? I mean, do you think, we haven't actually heard anything today that we haven't heard before, or do you think this really is new territory?
So I have mixed feelings, I have to tell you. I covered the first summit in 2000. I can tell you that that emotional roller coaster that South Koreans felt, we felt all of that in 2000. And this time around, South Koreans are a little bit more skeptical because we've been down this path before. And I have to say that a lot of this is pageantry. But, you know, we will take peace over provocation. So we have no choice but to look at this as a positive first step.
Governor Richardson, do you feel like we've been here before?
Yes, we've been there before. I know there have been two summits between North Korean and South Korean leaders that ended up disappointingly. But I think this Kim Jong-un man has an end game. I think he's a rational actor despite his unpredictability and some savage things that he's done. I think in the end he wants to trade possibly his military arsenal for economic growth, because this is one of the poorest countries on earth, a shattered economy, a gulag situation in many cases, people starving. I think that may be what he asks in return for the dismantling of his nuclear weapons, which I still think he's not going to do. It's going to take an awful lot if there is a final long-term agreement with North Korea.
And do you feel that you have to say the same of Donald Trump, that he is more rational and planned than perhaps you might have thought?
You know, I worry every morning when he's tweeting something. Lately, his tweets on North Korea have been okay, but, you know, I think what is called for now is traditional diplomacy. I'm glad the American Secretary of State has been confirmed. Now he can take over and let diplomats conduct the negotiations, not spies, and not out of the White House tweeting.
Do you now think reunification is something you will see?
No, not in the short term. Long term, who knows? I remember what we said about the Germans, and it happened. I don't believe so, but I do think that this is something that now enters the debate, but I have my doubts.
Jean Lee, same question.
Honestly, I don't think it's happening anytime soon, and I don't think South Koreans think it'll happen anytime soon. However, reconciliation is a different thing. Having a good relationship so they can coexist peacefully on this peninsula that they share is a positive step forward. We will probably see them talk about economic exchanges and ways to build relationships, both in terms of sports diplomacy, cultural exchanges, educational exchanges, and as I mentioned, economic exchanges. And that might be the extent of it.
Who ultimately, Jean Lee, do you think has the most to benefit here?
Who ultimately, you know, both sides benefit from this summit. You know, Kim Jong-un can go back to his people and show that he's reached this milestone. This is something his father and his grandfather did, which was to sit down with the South Korean president. Of course, he made some historic moves. He stepped foot in South Korea. It's the first time anyone's done that. What will be really key is whether he sits down with the president of the United States. That is something his father and his grandfather did not do.
And Governor Richardson, in terms of things the United States can offer and that South Korea can offer, should it go into these talks expecting to be pulling troops out of that peninsula?
I think the American-South Korean treaty relationship is not going to change, but maybe there's some, you know, gestures on the military side, maybe even some exchanges of the military. My dealings with the North Korean military have been positive. We were able to secure the remains of American soldiers in direct negotiations with the North Korean military. I think that they are more flexible than are given credit to. So I think that's one area that needs to be defined closely. But is it going to end the American-South Korean military war? Not by all means.
Governor Bill Richardson, Jean Lee, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
It's almost as if they were friends rather than sworn enemies. The pictures of the unpredictable and hostile dictator Kim Jong-un joking with and embracing the South Korean President Moon Jae-in today were almost as unexpected as the announcement that both leaders would work with the United States and China this year to declare an official end to the Korean War. At one point, apparently Kim joked that North Korea's early morning missile launches had likely awakened Moon numerous times and promised not to do it anymore. Unprecedented symbolism of peace for sure, but is the promise to work towards the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula to be believed? Here's our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban.
It was a day freighted with symbolism, starting with a step across Korea's ceasefire line. Kim Jong-un became the first North Korean leader to visit the South. And with his arrival came the prospect of an end to the peninsula's war psychosis and saber-rattling.
What we saw today was the two Korean leaders saying that they are willing to do anything to prevent war on the Korean Peninsula. And I think what President Moon did was to get North Korea committed enough to say that he can come with enough of a package to President Trump to deliver that, to say that I can essentially convince President Trump to at least prevent some kind of military war or conflict for at least, what, 2-3 years that's remaining in President Trump's first administration.
Today's agreement affirmed the principle of North and South determining the destiny of the Korean nation on their own accord. China and the US take note. It set out military confidence building measures, looked forward to balanced economic growth and co-prosperity, i.e. spreading some of the South's wealth northwards, committed the two sides to end the current armistice, working towards a permanent and solid peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. And it set the common goal of realizing through complete denuclearization a nuclear-free Korean Peninsula.
North Korea then is offering to end its state of war with the South with a peace treaty, expand economic ties and move, oh so slowly probably, towards denuclearization. The question for Western countries is whether they're prepared to accept what will in effect be a freeze in North Korea's nuclear status rather than complete disarmament in return for peace breaking out on the Korean Peninsula.
I think we can be relatively relaxed about the timeline for denuclearization. Moreover, I think time plays very much in our favor and in the South Koreans' favor, which is that the more North Korea opens up to the world, the greater appetite there will be for North Koreans for the kind of prosperity that South Koreans experience, for the kind of political freedoms that South Koreans experience.
There have been false dawns before, like in 2008, when North Korea blew up this key facility as part of a previous nuclear deal. So can Kim and the South Korean President Moon prevent this one unravelling in the same way as those previous agreements?
I think the most important difference in this particular agreement that we should not underestimate is the cooperation that he is showing with South Korea. And I think that is the most significant difference. What you see here is that North Korea is making very, very clear that he is absolutely leaving China and all the other powers out, and in fact that he is willing to cooperate with the United States, but that he is doing that very closely through South Korea. And this is really the significant difference from all the previous agreements.
Among today's symbolic acts was the inevitable tree planting. South Korea's President Moon is a moderate who's long called for the benefits of dialogue. But was he playing soft cop to Donald Trump's hard? And did America's squeeze on the North make all this possible?
They have allowed South Korea to lead on the policy, to produce the possibility of a Trump-Kim summit, to create the policy trade space for what any agreement might look like, to be our interlocutor with the North Koreans, but also the substantive definers of what a policy would look like. And that President Trump is empowering and incentivizing and supporting an American ally to take a lead in solving a major national security problem. Again, I would not have bet my money on that.
The White House today released photos of another handshake between Kim and Secretary of State designate Mike Pompeo. The stage is set now for a summit with President Trump, and it's America's judgment that will now be critical to the success of this emerging process.
Mark Urban, so how optimistic should we be that what happened today will bring real change? John Everard was Britain's ambassador to North Korea from 2006 to 2008. And in Boston, we're joined by Catherine Moon. She's a former State Department official who's now Professor of Asian Studies at Wellesley College, and she sits in the steering committee of America's National Committee on North Korea. Good evening to you both, and thank you for coming in. John Everard, first of all, what is Kim Jong-un's calculation, do you think?
Well, this is the question that everybody wants to ask and nobody can answer. Is he actually just trying to squeeze more money out of the South, split South Korea away from the United States, and perhaps generally sow confusion in the international community? Or is this really a change of heart? Now, this is a conundrum for us all. North Korea has cheated repeatedly in the past. The history of talks is littered with broken agreements. And, of course, everybody is approaching this with great care, great circumspection and some cynicism. On the other hand, if this is really a change of heart, if he is serious about stabilising the peninsula, then it would be a pity, to put it mildly, to throw the olive branch back in his face.
Well, let's turn to Catherine now on that. Now, you listened to what the two men had to say to each other on the border, and the language, I understand, that they were using, the words they were using were very interesting. Tell me about that.
Well, I listened in, and I do speak Korean and understand it, so it was helpful. It was very casual, meaning that for Koreans, generally, the formality is so important, especially between an elder statesman and an elder in general, like President Moon of South Korea, speaking with a younger person who could be like a son in terms of age. And I think what Mr. Moon did spectacularly was to give Kim Jong-un a sense of respect, a sense of space, and a generosity so that he could, quote, be himself, whatever that means. And Kim, in return, many people would not know, when he signed the guest book at the Peace House, and he talked about a new era of peace, it was done in a very poetic language. And it had a lot of aspiration and sort of an incantation about moving forward, embodied in his text.
Now,
so I think, I think those are interesting aspects.
Now, you'll have heard a contributor to Mark's film saying that part of this might be to freeze China and America out of the Korean Peninsula. And of course, at the moment as well, Russia and Japan are nowhere in this. What do you think, who do you think are going to be the key players in this going forward? We know that there's a series of summits. Next, it's Donald Trump. But who will matter in this, move?
I really don't think that the two Koreas have any intention to freeze any power in the region or the United States out. There's a very simple reason why. If North Korea were to be rehabilitated into the international society, if its economy is to be resurrected, China, Japan, the United States, Australia, Western Europe, Canada, all these countries are going to be necessary. They're requirements for North Korea to be able to get on economically and stand up on its feet. The South Koreans will not and cannot
do that,
burden that economic share.
So, in your view, then, who will be the key player?
Well, other than the two Koreas, I think it's unthinkable that you can solve the problems of the Korean Peninsula without the active participation both of the United States and of China. Now, you asked the question, I think, because in the Panmunjom Declaration, it talks about the Korean nation sorting its problems out by itself, which implies exclusion. That wouldn't have gone down well in Washington, or in Beijing for that matter. But somehow or other, they have to keep the big players on board.
And Japan's got a particular issue here. There's obviously, we've also got Japanese kidnapped and in North Korea. That's one small issue for the Japanese, the edges of this. But Japan does not want to be frozen out on this.
Japan definitely does not want to be frozen out. That was very clear in the conversations that Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan, was having with Donald Trump just earlier this month, where they talked a great deal about North Korea. Shinzo Abe came away largely reassured, but of course he's a bystander. There is no Shinzo Abe Kim Jong-un summit, planned.
So Catherine, Donald Trump is claiming this, very much for himself as being, the big mover and shaker in this. And actually, an American commentator, I think it was New York Times today, was talking about him that if he pulls this off, Trump should get the Nobel Peace Prize. What do you think in terms of, we know that in previous, his father reneged on previous deals. What would make a difference this time?
Right now, the big difference in terms of this summit is that Kim Jong-un came to the South. In the past, the South Korean presidents had gone to the North in 2000 and 2007. This is a big deal for a, quote, hermit kingdom leader to come out into a capitalist, cosmopolitan society, i.e. the South. Number two, for Kim Jong-un, this is a huge coming out party, and it is important for him because he sees himself as a leader of a nuclear state. And he has used the nuclear weapons to earn him that kind of stature.
But let me just quickly put you on. But the problem is that Kim Jong-un thinks, if he'll put away his nuclear weapons, the chances are the Americans will do that too. Is that a naive view of Kim Jong-un's, or is it not even the true view?
Well, yes, the great phrase that we're all focused on in the joint declaration, in the Panmunjom Declaration, is complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which means, in the North Korean mind, not just that we give up our nuclear weapons, but that nobody else is able to deliver a nuclear weapon to the peninsula. So that means the United States. Now, that, of course, just isn't going to fly. There's no way Washington's going to back to that.
Thank you both very much indeed.